Thank you to the three of you for joining this conversation. Great setup by Johan there. I just assume at this point that my Social Security number is all over the dark web. So you three have the same exact position, but in three very different industries. We've got healthcare represented, finance, and telecom. I thought, why don't we start with like an icebreaker where each of you shares a war story, like a challenge or a breach that really tested the resilience of your institution's systems and how you overcame it. Alan, let's start with you.
So, I thought about this question, and let's start with the challenge. And the challenge is you never want to be the reason. The reason why your CEO loses sleep at night because he has to recast, you trust my brand. The reason why your CFO has to recast the forecast or the guidance because something critical happened. And as I tell my staff often, boring is beautiful, and we want to keep things quiet. And so our challenge, the war, as you say, is to keep things steady, to keep things quiet, to keep things boring. And that within itself is a challenge every single day.
All right, so you want to be boring. Rich, what about you? What is one story you might share on?
Oh, gosh, well, I guess my first time I was a CISO was back in 2003 timeframe at a company called ChoicePoint, which was one of the first organizations that experienced a large-scale, even though it was called a breach, it was just an account takeover, not an actual hack. But back then, obviously, it caught the news. There was massive windfire. And I think the most important lesson learned out of that still carries forth is how you handle the event is equally as important as the actions that you take. So effective communication, transparency, when appropriate, are all very, very important things because of the fact that in today's world, it's not a matter of if you were breached. This is a matter of when or you actually recognize you have been.
I would argue even more important than the breach itself, and you wrote the book on it, so you would know. Munish, how about you? What story would you want to share?
I wouldn't say any specific, but I'll highlight the fact Johan spoke about, and I think a lot of what he said absolutely resonated with me, I think with the rest of the room here as well. It's a very tightly knit economy now, super well integrated. I think a lot of us must be following the events of the past few weeks. We saw some of the cloud service providers had some concerns and issues, and some of the content providers had some issues. So making sure that you're really well prepared, and this, I think we are all essentially trying to do the same thing, which is identify the critical points of failure or single points of failure, as they're called, control planes in certain areas, and making sure there are really strong resiliency plans to be able to deal with them, whether it's cyber or just an availability issue. In many ways, as we say it within the firm, you just have to have your clients be able to transact and engage with the institution or with the bank in this case. They need access to the money when they want it or the services we provide. So I think I won't specifically go to one, though I'd say the amount of activity that we see from nation-state actors in terms of trying to identify vulnerabilities on the edge device is only going up. So there is plenty happening in that space that we continue to keep a close watch on.
Well, we'll come back to nation-state hackers for sure, but you brought up some of the disruptions of late. I'm just going to call them out. AWS, CrowdStrike, Cloudflare, Microsoft, Amazon. I mean, we're talking about basically like the fabric of the internet being brought into question, and none of it is under your control. You can control Wells Fargo, CVS, and all of telecom, but in any of these situations, none of that matters. So let's talk about that third-party risk a little bit in more specificity. For example, the United Health hack. Nothing to do with CVS, and yet everything to do with CVS. How did that affect you, and like, what were the lessons learned for you?
So what we learned, actually, what was punctuated by that experience is that we don't work in a vacuum. Like CVS Health or any other healthcare company is not isolated. We work in an ecosystem. We're all dependent upon one another, and so it really emphasized the point of we have to architect for resiliency. We have to architect for making sure that we take into account any single point of failure. what we were most proud of is that despite the fact there was a widespread impact, our pharmacies were able to service our members and our patients. We were able to get through that. We were able to count on the solutions we put in place to work around the issue, and we can't take our eyes off the ball, as they say. We have to continue to identify where those single points of failures are. We have to account for them and continue to stress test those points of failure.
Great. And Rich, I'm not going to call out AT&T for any particular specific incident, but, you've been through enough companies and enough industries where you've seen that third-party risk arise. How does telecom deal with that?
Well, telecom's a little bit unique because in telecom, you might have three networks. You have your traditional IT network, your wireless network, and your wireline network. And a big part of that wireline and wireless networks is dependent upon third parties, just because of the infrastructure and all the equipment that goes into that. So having a very strong third-party program doesn't mean just having the controls, but it's also the ability to have the monitoring associated with it, to understand that if there is a member of your supply chain that actually falls victim, what is your actions, what is your protocol, what's in your contracts, understanding all that. I still think a lot of organizations don't understand and focus on all their B2B connections to understand which ones are live and not live. Just like everything else that we're challenged with as Chief Information Security Officers, understand that inventory of connectivity to your B2B providers is critical, because just like a dormant cloud instance or dormant AI agents, if you don't understand what connections you have, whether they're live or not live, it is a channel that can oftentimes be exploited.
Rich, you mentioned B2B. AT&T is interesting. And your role is interesting in that you're not just protecting the internal operations and data of AT&T. You've also outwardly begun offering a service to customers at AT&T. Can you describe that and your role in it?
Yeah, sure. Our thought is we need to take what has been basically a traditional detective type of approach. Let's tell you about bad things happening. Let's tell you you're having bad things happening. And because AT&T, 1/3 of the world traffic runs across it, we said, hey, can we be preventive? What can we do upstream to knock down basically bad things? And initially focused on the small to medium business, but obviously we're seeing this expansion in the enterprise space. Yeah. A basic statistic is on a month-to-month basis right now, we're basically blocking like 36 billion threats, right?
What is that
month.
Percentage-wise for like every single customer?
Haven't done it. Just depends on the size of the customers, depends on how much traffic they have going. But in essence, all we're trying to do is filter out the bad, and we see anywhere from 10 to 70% of customers' traffic bad.
Wow, 70%. Munish, I want to pivot over to you at Wells Fargo. Those hacks, multiple hacks at the U.S. Treasury Department, one can argue that that is another third-party risk, and I'd like to understand how Wells Fargo has responded to that.
I can get into that. By the way, as Rich was speaking, this is a classic example of us as a financial institution relying on the controls and the processes he's putting in place and the detections So this is an area where we all really collaborate and partner. So very grateful for the work he and his team are doing. Before I get into the specifics of the question you asked, gone are the days when you could just do an assurance program over a third party. Once a year, once every couple of years, check in to see, answer my question, let me see your control posture. That's where you are a little bit of a problem. You have to be really categorizing your third parties in terms of what is your critical third party engagement, what's the critical infrastructure, and how are you really monitoring the interactions with that relationship. So in that way, the two that you mentioned are no different. I must say, in this space, there was extreme candor and transparency right from the beginning. Okay. So we knew exactly what was going on. The right parties were brought together. And I think that's at the heart of getting to the right outcome. So if you have a third party that is less than candid about what is going on, it becomes very challenging to be able to intercept exactly how do you actually react from the perspective of a consumer of that service. What's the impact to your customer data? What's the impact to your services? When you have a counterparty, whether it's part of the government or otherwise, that is open about what is going on, it becomes a lot easier to get to the bottom of the things. And I must say, what it did tell us is that the significance and the importance of fundamentals, like getting basic access management right,
Right.
is still paramount. Paramount. You can talk about AI all day long, but all of these capabilities using data, using signals, etc., sits on top of very robust foundations. If your foundation, you're not looking at that in the right way, then it could be problematic.
I mean, maybe we should talk about that, Ryan. Just basic hygiene and the fact that we still live in this world. How do we still live in this world where so many breaches happen because the password is password? Like, how do you solve for that finally, once and for all? Rich, Rich, you've been in the business for a long time. I won't say how many years, but how do you solve for that finally? Is it just education? Like,
I mean, education is critical. We want people to be good digital citizens and understand good practices, just like anything. But as practitioners, we look at things and we look at the MITRE ATT&T framework, and the farther up the framework you can go to put a control in, right, the more powerful as it gives you time to do other things. So, I mean, we have to move towards passwordless type of approaches. We have to go with anti-phishing techniques for authentication. The identity cycle is huge. I mean, if you look at in the last 18 months, the amount of organizations that have fell victim, because of exploitation of identity is traumatic. So I think what we have to do is look towards doing the basics fundamentally well, but also moving up that attack chain to mitigate those threats. It's not just MFA anymore. It's basically phish-proof MFA, right, or phish-resistant MFA is where you need to go to. Keep in mind, the bad guys have the opportunity to reverse engineer every control that we establish to find an edge. And in today's world with AI, the biggest challenge is speed. The adversaries have the advantage right now because of the speed capability associated with AI. Now imagine AI and quantum. Quantum's power. Can you imagine when AI and quantum get married? It's going to be a whole new world.
Yeah. Ellen, you similarly have been in a few different sectors. Very interesting companies in your background. And I wondered, in terms of like basic education and security defenses, how does healthcare and CVS stack up with some of the other companies and industries that you've worked with, and how is it different?
I think the biggest difference is the regulation. So I think healthcare versus something like media, the regulations that we're under, the scrutiny that we're under. You're talking about HIPAA, you're talking about the FDA, there's different regulatory agencies that scrutinize us and everything that we do. And so our obligation to our members and our patients is, our moral obligation is very high, and our statutory obligation is even higher. So we have to meet a very high trust standard, and we can't take our eyes off of that. But to build off of what Rich just said, there are two things that are going on. Put the technology aside. There's tempo and there's access. And those things coming together, now layer on the technology, we have a serious riddle to solve here. Because the cost of access is getting lower all the time. You don't have to be a nation-state actor to act like one.
You just have to have ChatGPT.
You just have to have ChatGPT, and off you go. Right? And then the tempo. I mean, we can know the old castle and moat approach that companies take. That's operating at human speed. We have to operate at machine speed. So all of the investments are how can we quickly accelerate the way in which we react. And then you have to understand those things. And so we're talking about anti-phishing techniques and access to those nature. But if you're designing for human resilience, which is what we're talking about, the more complex you make those things, the more likely you are to miss a step, and then human dependency becomes your problem.
Right, right. That's a good point. I want to get to a question up on the board from the audience because I think it's a really good one. Is there a new or emerging threat that is likely to cause widespread issues, specifically because of advancement in AI, which is, I think, what Ellen and Rich are touching on? Munish, why don't you take this one? What specifically scares you?
I think there is always something on the horizon. So I think it pays to be a little paranoid in this space and making sure that you're watching all aspects of what is happening in terms of advancements in technology. But I think almost everybody in the room heard that orchestration of the attack using a large language model, from Anthropic. And what we are now seeing is, a few quarters ago, it was phishing emails generated by AI software. Look quite realistic and hard to fend off. And okay, we adjust to that. Deep fakes, got it. Understood a few controls, that we put in place for that. Ability to generate voice-based authentication, yes, that's also a risk. But this is different. This is using the LLM to be able to engineer an attack and orchestrate it in minutes. That's quite unprecedented. So what you're seeing is that from our perspective, yes, you have to be able to defend against that using similar tools and techniques, but also if you haven't taken the time to build your infrastructure, access management, like really robust design of segmentation and getting ready, it can become very difficult. There's another stat that I want to mention. It's not related to the question directly per se, but I think it'll resonate with the audiences. The quickest lateral movement is now under a minute. Oh. Imagine 51 seconds, 50 odd seconds, under a minute for something to come in and move laterally. So you marry that with the advancements to generate code, and Johan was mentioning it, you don't even have to have extreme cyber background, or you could buy these capabilities on the marketplace and unleash, against very established industries and companies. That's a challenge that we have all got to be ready for together and individually as our own institutions.
And just to define lateral movement for those who, aren't living and breathing cyber every day, you're talking about that point of entry, whether it's an employee's email account, and then suddenly using that to jump into some key critical infrastructure, correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Move away from the source to another part of the infrastructure, yeah.
Right. And Rich, that's the one side of it. That's how the bad guys are using AI. How are the good guys using AI to counter the bad guys?
There are lots of examples. I know a lot of CISOs, as they're looking at how do you incorporate AI into what you're doing, are really asking their teams to go and say, answer this question, or this riddle, as you said it. Riddle me this. If AI can do this, how does it change things? And some of those things are speed to detection, action and correlation, bringing together disparate data sets. So I've seen the use of AI from a simple standpoint, where it's basically using a large language model to do something as simple as ask security. And you ask the question, how do you protect internet-facing applications? It comes up with all the controls, pulls in all the architectural diagrams, everything that an app owner might need to be used, to even moving along further now, taking all the disparate data through the different intelligence that's available out there, pulling that in, matching it against your inventory, then based on that inventory and based on the probability of occurrence as well as the threat actors, putting together a calculation from risk that then puts forth a recommended action, which then enables someone to just push a button to remediate the fix. So it really just depends on how people are using the application. But there are great opportunities to use AI to optimize what we're doing as defenders.
Yeah, those are impressive ideas. I want to stay with you for a second, because there is a question here about what new ways industry leaders are collaborating to share information and deepen their understanding to control risk. And I'm staying with you, Rich, because that sharing of information has really escalated in the telecom industry in recent months for reasons that maybe you may or may not want to get into. But I thought maybe you could share that some notes on that effort.
Sure. Specific to telecom, there's lots of ISACs that are out there. There hadn't been really one established. So we all got together. There actually 23 of us have information sharing agreements in place today. Everything from Australia to Japan to the UK to Germany to Spain to Canada and within the United States. And we've put together guidelines, and our teams get together on a monthly basis, share what's going on, examples that protect us, and then we're taking that even further and formalizing it. We're coming together with our key vendors and actually not just sharing information, but sharing expectations to them on how we want to make sure that their products are actually secure. Going back to your third party, you have to start with the supply chain and get them all to a certain level of protection before it comes into your environment. So, I can appreciate the information sharing model. I've been doing this since the Clinton administration, and there's great models out there, but sometimes you just have to just go do. And I know from a telecom standpoint, what we're doing is we're actually doing, and not only are we sharing the information, we're collaborating, because in order to effectively drive the change that we're looking to do in our environment, it really does take a global approach to it. You know, a particular telecom, even if they take actions on different types of things, are very limited. But when you collaborate with all the telecommunications around the world, you can actually see an entire campaign ongoing, and hopefully the actions we can take to help mitigate those risks.
So one of the most pervasive hacks in recent history has been this telecom hack that was orchestrated by a state-sponsored actor. And Munish, you mentioned that state-sponsored hacking is very much on the rise. We know that banking and telecom are critical infrastructure pieces that these kinds of hackers tend to target. Healthcare is also a critical infrastructure and a less appreciated part of that targeting of state-sponsored hacking. And I wondered if you could share what you're seeing from nation-state hackers on the health side.
So the thing about nation-state actors is the way we've seen their behaviors not so much evolve, but could stay consistent, which I think is just as scary. Incredibly patient. They will harvest that investment and they will sit in stasis for years, and they will wait. And all of a sudden you realize they have moved laterally, and they have more information on you than you realize. And when they decide to cash in, as they say, they'll take everything. I mean, the recent F5 hack, I mean, they got it all. And the impact of that was that exposure for hundreds of customers who use those technology platforms, and the reaction creates enormous amount of risk. Because the one thing that, especially at scale, which is true, a stability issue is a security issue. Those things go hand in glove. If you don't have resiliency, if you don't have stability, you have a security problem. And you can't separate those two. I have two roles at CVS Health. I run infrastructure and I run security. And the reason why we brought those two things together is because we can't separate the issues. And so we said we're going to treat them the same. And so the answer to your question is that when we establish trust with our patients and our members, we establish continuity. It's important that we ensure that all those things comprise what we consider critical infrastructure. As the last publicly traded large distribution pharmacy in the United States, we have to work. And so what we're seeing out in the market is that we have third-party risk. We've got supply chain disruption risk. We have the quote-unquote traditional security exposure risk. And then we have market exposure risk.
Right. And now geopolitical risk. This is a good question for Munish here. Financial institutions often have these critical legacy systems, which I think is shorthand for old. What strategies have you found most successful for identifying vulnerabilities? And maybe in one way, I would word it as like, what are the big red flags? Like, you know, what are you looking out for?
Well, I think this is partially true, but the way to look at it is, it's less about whether you have legacy system or not. The way to think about it is, how do you consistently identify vulnerabilities, and how do you, Bridge partially touched on this. It's less about a signal coming from one source at this point. Of course, like we do vulnerability scoring, and we'll patch it whether it's legacy or not. We'll take care of it if we don't have mitigating controls around it, or if we see the risk, what was called the residual risk after applying the mitigation controls on that vulnerability. If we still feel that the risk is high, we'll take care of it whether it is modern or not. I think I would say the way to think about it is now picking up signals from different sources and then putting them together. So the data has never been more important to be able to stitch that together, sometimes using your expertise, but in many cases now increasingly using models, LLM models, to be able to say, it's also a term, see vulnerability chaining. Yes, they are level 4, not very severe if you ignore it, but if you put 3 together, 4 together, 5 together, does it start to create an opening on your software that you must get in front of, or that you probably have a vulnerability score that is low, but you also have an end of life on that underlying device, so code vulnerable, device vulnerable, infrastructure, you got to look at it differently. So it's not particularly the way question is framed. I'd slightly look at it differently, which is you got to be able to take a holistic approach, risk assess, and then apply your controls and see what's the action to take. And usually you get your answer very, very clearly.
All right. Well, you've solved cybersecurity then, I guess. We're out of town, but Rich, I can't end this discussion without asking you. You did this role for the CIA. I mean, what was that like? Like, what is the single most shocking thing about working for the CIA in a CISO role?
I think one of the most shocking things was I thought it was like a folk tale story of some sorts. But when I first got there, I was hearing about these individuals, new kids that were being hired, showing up on their first day and realizing they're not allowed to take their cell phone into the building, so they quit.
Oh, they quit.
Yeah.
They just got about. I would too. I would too. Well, thank you so much for joining us. What an awesome conversation. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.